Hello, welcome to the debate on Sky News. I'm Martin Stanford with our take on developments brought together from America, the UK and around the world. Halting the Islamic State of terror. Should the US unite with Russia and the Arab states? For Syrian refugees, the numbers are growing, the needs are growing, and aid is declining. Same-sex marriage. Must Kim Davis now just do her job?
Under whose authority?
Whose authority?
Under God's authority.
The White House wants Russia to focus more on fighting Islamic State rather than simply backing the Syrian regime. Is now the time for America to unite with Russia and the Arab states to fight the group, which they call Daesh? And should Middle Eastern and Gulf countries do more to ease the refugee crisis? In a moment, we'll speak to Prince Turki al Faisal, the former head of Saudi intelligence for almost 25 years, before moving on to be the Saudi ambassador in London and Washington. As usual, the Democrat commentator Jeffrey Robinson is in New York and the Conservative commentator Armstrong Williams is standing by in Washington. Jeffrey, welcome back to our programme. The situation with the refugees and how the country, the world really, should try and deal with this in one that's most pressing. Are you encouraged or discouraged by what nations are saying to one another?
I'm very discouraged simply because they're not taking the refugee crisis seriously enough. I mean, sure, President Obama said that the United States would take 10,000 Syrian refugees, but look at what's going on in Hungary with people on the wrong side of a fence that they've just built to keep those refugees out, or in their words, to restore order to the refugee crisis. These are human beings who are in desperate, desperate need of help. And in some cases, they're just not getting it.
And Armstrong, international collaboration about Syria and what to do about it. It seems to just gone off everyone's agenda. Don't we need to get back round the table and talk about it at least?
You know, they're very good at talking in terms of finding resolution. That's a different story. You know, anybody should be struck by the fact that Saudi Arabia is not willing to admit one refugee, a migrant to its country, nor Qatar. Saudi Arabia is willing to build 200 mosques around Europe, but not one refugee in its country. And I mean, that should be a sign that these people who understands that culture, they understand that way of life, they understand who these people are, they should be the first to reach out to show compassion and some kind of deep connection to these people who are looking for a better way of life. The last thing that should happen is for President Obama to accept not 10,000, but one. I mean, you look at a place like Lewistown, Maine, and you see what has happened when you brought the Somalians in here and what that neighborhood has become and how destructive and how dismal it is, because these people can't speak the language, they don't understand the culture. You bring them here for that false hope. You should make it work for those people where they are. And also, when you talk about asylum, once they receive asylum, when you bring them here, you're talking about young men in their 20s who have 4 and 5 wives and so many children. All that comes to the United States. It may start at as 10, it may go up to 50, and as high as 100,000. Who knows? No, that problem needs to be dealt with right in the Middle East, and Saudi Arabia should lead the way.
Armstrong, thank you. Let's bring in Prince Turki al Faisal, who's a former head of Saudi intelligence for almost 25 years before moving on to be the Saudi ambassador in London and Washington. His father was, of course, King Saudi of Arabia during the 60s and 70s. Prince Turki al Faisal, thank you for being with us today. Why has Saudi Arabia done so little to sort out the Syrian problem?
I don't know where you get your information, nor that gentleman, because since the crisis in Syria started, Saudi Arabia has received 2.5 million Syrians. We don't consider them refugees. We give them residency permits and visas to travel through the kingdom if they want to go somewhere else. So please correct that impression. Not only the kingdom, but other Gulf states are equally treating the Syrians in the same way. And that is the misconception and misinformation, unfortunately, that you are disbanding and that you are telling everybody, which should be corrected.
Well, I'm glad we've had the chance to correct it. But on the political stage, is there more that Saudi could do to bring an end to the conflict in Syria, which would then presumably stop the flow of refugees?
That's one thing that Saudi Arabia has been trying to do since the beginning of the unrest in Syria. And unfortunately, the world community has not been willing to respond nor to take the corrective action that is needed. You know, if there is one person who was taken as a refugee somewhere around the world, namely the present so-called president of Syria, there would be no other refugees having to go somewhere else to seek their livelihood. It's because of that person and his killing machine that has been inflicting harm and destruction on his own people for the last 4 years. We're going on to 5 years now that we have this situation.
What do you think should be done about Daesh? And what should the international response be? Because if Syria wasn't already complicated, Daesh and its power and its grab of territory has made it more so.
Well, you know, first thing is don't call it Daesh or ISIS or ISIL or IS. That gives it a semblance of legitimacy, because Daesh in Arabic means the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. I prefer to call it fahish, which is the Arabic word for a sinful conduct and obscenity. And that's one aspect. The other aspect, of course, is that fahish is a result of the failing state in Syria and in Iraq. If you fix those failing states, there would not be fahish to operate from anywhere in that area.
Jeffrey, let me put that point to you. If you were to fix Syria and fix Iraq, ISIS goes away. Do you subscribe to that point of view?
ISIS may go away. I don't think the underlying problem will go away. But what I'd like to know, and Excellency, thank you for being on the program. I personally very much appreciate it as somebody who's written about Saudi Arabia. You are the grandson of the founder of the kingdom, King Saud, and the son of one of the most remarkable Middle Eastern leaders, King Faisal, who had an unbelievably astute vision of foreign policy for Saudi Arabia. So let me ask you point blank, what would your dad have done differently?
In answer to that, first of all, my late father, God rest his soul, left the kingdom when he was 13 years old to represent his father at the Versailles Peace Conference after the First World War. And he was Saudi Arabia's foreign minister for more than 45 years, so he practically visited the whole world at that time. But to get back to what the late King Faisal would have done, I think he would have done what Saudi Arabia is trying to do now, which is to collect a concert of world leaders to fix the situation in Damascus and Baghdad. In Baghdad, there was a change of government, as you know, from the dysfunctioning, very sectarian-oriented al-Maliki to perhaps, hopefully, a less sectarian government under Abadi. In Damascus, nobody wants to do that. Nobody wants to remove Assad. And I think if they would do that, we would go a long way towards resolving the issue there, because the Arab League presented to the United Nations a proposal for an interim government that would have full powers and would remove this horrible person who attracts more to fahish than other situations because of his mistreatment of his people.
Let me bring in Armstrong Williams, if I may. Armstrong, I know you were critical in your opening remarks here of the way the world has dealt with this particular problem. If the Arab states are getting together and they have a plan, should the US, should the UK get behind that plan?
You know, I want to go back and challenge our guests' assertions that they've taken in 2.5 million refugees. You know, so I guess the New York Times, the Washington Times, the Daily Caller, the Washington Post, and international papers that continue to print that Saudi Arabia has 100,000 air-conditioned tents not far from Syria that is used when people make their pilgrimage to Mecca, these air-conditioned tents to house almost 3 million people. Saudi Arabia has not lifted a finger to take in these refugees, but yet it is offered to build 200,000 mosques in Germany. So you're saying that the press is lying and spreading propaganda?
Well, sir, you are definitely spreading propaganda. I don't know about the New York Times or other publications, but they should come and see the reality on the ground. Saudi Arabia has put out an official statement. It stands by what it puts out, and the figures speak for themselves. As far as helping the Syrian refugees, wherever we can, whether in Syria itself, or in Jordan, or in Lebanon, or in Turkey, the kingdom has been one of the biggest contributors through the United Nations for the efforts that have been put to find relief and comfort for these unfortunate people who have been driven out of their country. So to accuse Saudi Arabia of not doing anything simply because you or the New York Times or other publications have said that we haven't, I think is not only unfair, but it is really contrary to the reality.
OK, well, just to press you on the point, though, when the Hajj is over, what about that tented village, which, as Armstrong suggests, does apparently house millions of people? Could you put that to good use, looking after refugees?
We are putting to good use what we have. We're giving these people residency permits in Saudi Arabia to work and to prosper and to find whatever they want in life. We have provided more than 100,000 places in our schools for the children of these people who have come to Saudi Arabia. So there is no need for this tent city in Saudi Arabia because we don't consider these people as refugees. When they come, they get residency permits, they can work, they can find a livelihood, they can find housing, they can find schooling, they can find hospitalization. We don't treat them like refugees. We treat them like fellow Arabs and brother Arabs.
Armstrong, but this is it is already, I know, playing a part in the discussion in the United States with the electoral candidates, the presidential hopefuls, not maybe the minutiae of exactly Middle Eastern politics, but homeless people or desperate people trying to get across Europe. That certainly plays with an audience, doesn't it? And they want their political leaders to do something about it.
Have you visited American cities, New York, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles? Have you seen the impact of homelessness that we have in our own country? Do you remember Katrina, when we had babies floating on the water, and that the people in Katrina, our own Americans, were referred to as refugees and never got the help and the support that they wanted? We have people suffering in our country, and you're telling us that we should not ignore our countrymen who have not benefited from this so-called the American economy, the American dream, still looking for their way of life. When you talk about places like California, where they've seen the impact of illegal immigration and what it's doing to their city, and now you're asking America to take on people that they barely know, to bring in this country that already burdensome those who cannot find homes, cannot find a way of life in America. I think Americans are to the point where in times of plenty and when America is prosperous and can do these things, we're willing to do it. But it's time for Europe and the Middle East, and especially countries like Saudi Arabia, to take care of their own. That time is here. It is their responsibility and not that of the United States.
Jeffrey, is that a reasonable United States perspective, do you think?
Not at all. Not at all. Completely belies history and belies the foundation of the United States as a nation of refugees. In fact, we have a very big heart, and we should open it up. One of the things that has always fascinated me about foreign policy in the kingdom, Your Excellency, is the fact that it's very much like an iceberg. You see 1/8 of it, but there's 7/8 of it that don't get seen. What's happening in that 7/8 right now, as far as this crisis is concerned? What aren't we seeing?
You're seeing what I'm seeing, which is Saudi Arabia acting to, first of all, fix the situation in Damascus and in Baghdad, and working in conjunction with fellow Arab countries and also international community through the United Nations and through the Friends of Syria group, of which the United States is a leading partner. We're partners in the coalition that is fighting Fahish in Syria. We're also providing humanitarian help to the refugees in Iraq that have been displaced by the incursion of Fahish from Syria into Iraq. The kingdom gave $500 million to the United Nations Fund to help those refugees find settlement in Iraq. These things are pretty much above ground. There is nothing below ground because we act in total transparency on these issues. We have nothing to hide, and we're proud of what we're doing.
No, I wasn't suggesting you have something to hide. I was suggesting that things go on backstage that the world doesn't see. You are supplying, the Saudi Air Force has been on bombing missions to Syria. Are ground troops being ruled out?
as far as I know, the kingdom has offered many months ago, if not a year and a half ago, that ground troops should be put in Syria and that Saudi Arabia would be willing to do that. Nobody has come through to agree to that. In the meetings that our foreign minister had with Mr. Kerry and Mr. Lavrov just a couple of weeks ago, I think, probably in Moscow, we talked with the Russians and the Americans about a future solution for Syria. Obviously, there are basic disagreements between us and the Russians, and that is on the issue of Bashar al-Assad. The Russians want him to play a role in the interim government. We think that as a killer of his own people and as someone who has murdered more than 300,000 Syrians, that he doesn't deserve to have a place on that situation. These are basic differences that we have with the Russians. America has called for the removal of Assad, and I hope that they will stick to that position, because he is the biggest attraction for the people who come and join Fahish and the other terrorist groups that are operating in Syria. As long as he and his murderous regime last, there will always be volunteers that will join Fahish and other groups like that.
Prince Turki al Faisal, thank you for being our guest today.
Thank you.
And a reminder, you can catch up with the Sky News debate on Apple TV, Roku, and Catch Up, and of course at skynews.com/US. Same-sex marriage is a controversial issue. The Kentucky clerk, Kim Davis, has just returned to work after a short spell in jail. She had refused to authorise marriage licences for gay couples. But apparently she doesn't have the support of her fellow Americans. A poll shows that 2/3 of people want Miss Davis just to do her job, regardless of her religious objections. So when a conflict arises between religious convictions and the law, which should prevail? Well, Peter Wehner is the Senior Fellow of Ethics and Public Policy Center. He's also a former White House aide for Presidents Reagan and for both George H. and George W. Bush. So what's the answer, Peter? What should prevail?
Well, it depends on facts and circumstances. I don't think that there are an absolute that you can apply. My view in general is that if you can accommodate religious convictions, as it relates to executing the law, you should do that, that there are boundaries to that. And I think in this case, Kim Davis is wrong. She's a public official. Her job is to issue marriage licenses. That's the law of the land. And for her to say that she will not do that based on her religious convictions, really, I think is a prescription for chaos, because there's no end to this. People could come up with all sorts of reasons that their religious convictions will lead them to not follow the law. So I think the options in this case is she could have resigned, or the Judge Bunning, the judge in this case, I think did a good faith effort to try and accommodate this, which is to have her deputies sign the marriage licenses. So Ms. Davis would not have to do an action that she sees as against her religious beliefs, but the law would be executed. I think that's completely reasonable and the right approach. And I think that Judge Bunning is prudential and deserves to be praised for this solution.
Yeah, I mean, the judge just dosed out a bit of common sense to everybody, didn't he?
I think so. Apparently, Ms. Davis and her lawyers and some other people who are supporters of her don't agree. But look, I think that he was trying to find a way out of this. In America, there is a view which is really wed to the founding and in our founding documents and really kind of the American DNA, which is that there should be accommodations when possible for religious beliefs. But if you're a public official, that changes. So, for example,
really?
Let me give you a particular example. If you were a florist or a baker, these cases have come up in the United States. I don't think you can be compelled to service a wedding, a gay wedding, if that's against your religious convictions. But if you're a public official and that's your job and you're told to do it, you either have to do it or you can resign in good conscience, or you can find a solution like the one Judge Bunning did. But you cannot, as a country, and I don't think as a Christian, go forward and say we're going to take the law into our own hands, and I'm just going to pick and choose what laws we're going to follow.
Well, OK, let's bring in Jeffrey and Armstrong on this. Armstrong, let me toss this one at you. Really, that I can have a faith, I can have religious convictions, but if I work in the wrong job, they've just got to go right out the window.
America is a nation of laws. And no matter how much our founders believed that we're equal under the laws did not always protect all of its citizens. That is why we had slavery. And so you could substitute what we're talking about with Ms. Davis, somebody in an interracial relationship, or somebody who's gay, or somebody who's fat. You don't get to deny people the same protections that we all are deserving under our laws just because you decide that you bring your conscience and your feelings to a job, especially if you work for the government. We're not interested in your beliefs and how you feel. You're in that position to uphold the law and protect people, and not to make people feel bad or to make people feel less than. And in this country, there are ways to fight these battles. The way to fight these battles, yes, it went to the Supreme Court. It became a de facto ruling. And what it shows is that our Congress abdicated its responsibility. And what the Supreme Court did was left wide open and so unprotected in so many ways, religious liberty and freedom and traditional marriage. And so what we have to do is go back to Congress, these people that are elected, all 535 of them, and ask them to do their job. We don't need to make heroes out of Ms. Davis or anyone else who violates and who don't respect the law. Now, you may say that the Supreme Court ruling did not give her enough time, the people in those positions, to adjust to the new ruling by the Supreme Court. But still, she has to understand her defiance is not who we are as Americans. You've got to respect the rule of law. And if you don't like the law, go to your Congress and your legislatures and just change the law to protect those things of conscience that you care so much about.
Jeffrey, is that good enough?
Well, I almost agree with Armstrong.
Really?
It's the new season. I almost agree with him. When he got onto the Supreme Court business, it's obvious that he missed 8th grade civics. But what strikes me about this case, and I think Peter has not mentioned it, she took an oath. She put her hand in the Bible and swore to God that she would uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States. Very simple. She wasn't thrown in jail for her religious beliefs. She was thrown in jail for contempt of court. Whole different story. And when you get the snake oil salesman like Governor Huckabee using this poor woman as an excuse for his misguided presidential ambitions and to raise political money for himself, it becomes all the more abhorrent. She has an easy way out. She's got a very simple way out. She can say, I cannot in full conscience uphold my oath, therefore I will resign. She hasn't done it because she's earning $80,000 a year in that job, and now we know what the price of her religion is.
Peter Wehner, it's just about price?
No, I don't think it's just about price. I agree she could resign, but I don't think in this case it's necessary because, as I said earlier, I think Judge Bunning gave a perfectly valid solution. And I'll say on behalf of Kim Davis, and I'm obviously critical of her, I think she made the wrong decision. When she took on the job as a clerk, same-sex marriages weren't legal. They weren't legal in Kentucky, and the Supreme Court changed the equation. Now, my view is the Supreme Court changed the equation. It's the law of the land, and she does have to follow it. And I think Jeffrey is right. She took an oath to execute that law, and she has to abide by it, or she has to find a way out of it. I would just add, in addition, I'm just full disclosure, I'm a Christian. I'm an Orthodox Christian, so I'm not coming at this from somebody who's critical of the Christian faith. I actually think that this is a bad witness and testimony to the Christian faith for a variety of reasons. For one thing, I think she's probably being theologically selective. I suspect that Ms. Davis has given marriage licenses to couples that have divorced for unbiblical grounds. I don't know why she would choose to make same-sex marriage the issue, the hill to die on, versus some other issues.
Peter, seeing as you've mentioned your Christian faith in that last answer, let me just ask you about that. In all the work you did for the presidents you served, were there not occasions when the work you were doing or the policy you helped develop actually went against or was rubbing up as a friction against your religious beliefs?
You know, there were actually not many. The enhanced interrogation techniques, the waterboarding issue, actually that did come up. I didn't know about it at the time because I wasn't in a position to know about it. But after
right, I don't think waterboarding was on the Sermon on the Mount, was it?
No, but there's a lot that's not on the Sermon on the Mount. You don't want to be simplistic about it. There's a whole history of Christian theology of how to apply and how not to apply certain verses, and a lot of people just simplistically try and do it. And I don't buy into that. I think that you have to take these things with some amount of prudence, and you have to be able to read the Bible in a relatively sophisticated way. But I'm just telling you honestly that did come up, and I had conversations when I was in the White House with friends of mine, including people who were Christian, about the morality of this, the question of ends and means. And I actually brought in people from outside the White House to speak to people in the NSC to work through the morality of this problem. I actually think it's probably more complicated than you do, but it was a real issue. But for the most part, I did not find that. I can't remember very many or any circumstances in which I was told to do something that I thought was against my religious faith. I'll just say one other thing. I'm very, very wary, just in general, then this applies to conservatives and liberals, which is to try and take the Bible and just simplistically connect the dots and say Jesus would support X or Y policy. I just think that's very dangerous ground. I think what you can argue for is a certain kind of moral ethic, the advancement of justice and the moral good. But when you go from that to saying, well, if you're a Christian, you're going to be in favor of expanding Medicaid or not, I think that's problematic ground, and I've been arguing that for pretty much my entire public life.
I'm sure that's an issue we'll come back to in later editions of this programme. But Peter Wehner, thank you very much indeed. And thank you for watching. That's it for this edition of The Debate. You can continue watching Sky News on Apple TV, on Roku, on Catch Up, and of course on skynews.com. Until next time, goodbye.